Welcome to the Town and Country Compounding Podcast, where we delve into the heart of personalized healthcare and explore the transformative role of compounding pharmacies. I'm your host, Steve, Director of Strategic Partnership here at Town and Country Compounding. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome a guest who's not just a leading voice in the compounding industry, but also a champion for regulatory clarity and patient access. Joining us is Scott Brunner, Chief Executive Officer of the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding, or APC. Scott, thank you for being here. We dive into all the nerd knitting golden stuff with compounding. Could you give our listeners a brief overview of APC's mission and your role in advocating for the compounding industry?
Yeah, happy to. And thanks, Steve, for having me. These are interesting times for compounding, and I'm sure we'll discuss why that might be so. APC, the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding, is the industry trade association. Our members are compounding pharmacists and technicians, supply chain professionals, marketers, even prescribers, regulators, and a few patients. We represent about 600 small businesses across the U.S., and our individual memberships number in around 5,000 or so. And our sweet spot is advocacy. We advocate on behalf of the patients who are served by compounded medications, and certainly on behalf of the pharmacies and outsourcing facilities that prepare those drugs.
Got it. Thank you for that. Thank you. It's amazing what you guys do. I think of like APHA, ASHP, but for compounding, there's no better professional organization than yours. So I really appreciate it. You gave your perspective in an article recently titled Perspective, Eli Lilly's Intervention and FDA's Lawsuit against FDA. Can you please give our listeners your perspective of this high level? We'll give them the link to the article. They'll probably pop up over here somewhere. But yeah, what's your perspective on it?
Yeah. Knowing where to start is probably a difficult thing. I presume that your listeners know that both tirzepatide and semaglutide, the active pharmaceutical ingredient in these blockbuster GLP-1 drugs, have been in shortage for a protracted period of time. Semaglutide since March of 2022, and up until December, tirzepatide had been in shortage since December of 2022, so 2 years. FDA declared last fall that the tirzepatide shortage was resolved. That immediately resulted in a lawsuit by OFA, one of our sister associations, the Outsourcing Facilities Association. And OFA asserted that FDA had been cavalier and arbitrary in ending the tirzepatide shortage, that it had relied on incomplete, at best, data, and that the agency should have gone through notice and comment rulemaking to determine that that shortage was resolved. Within days of OFA filing that lawsuit, FDA came back and said to the court, give us a chance to reconsider this, remand it back to us, and give us a period of time when we can reconsider that decision. That alone is fairly extraordinary, that the agency would preemptively, before the court has read any briefs, taken any action, ask the court to remand it. The court agreed. FDA was given 60 days. The 60 days turned into 90 days with the agreement of OFA and the court. And December 19th sort of became the drop dead date, where FDA was to come back to the court and either say, oh, we were wrong and the shortage is not resolved, or they could double down on that decision. Well, on December 19th, they doubled down. They said, indeed, the tirzepatide shortage is resolved, and they stipulated a 60-day window in which traditional compounding pharmacies could continue to prepare copies of the FDA-approved tirzepatide injectables, while pharmacies, really that 60 days was to give pharmacies time to transition the patients from the compounded version of the drug to the FDA-approved drug. It was to make sure that there would not be interruptions of that therapy. FDA also indicated that it would give 503B outsourcing facilities 90 days to continue to distribute those drugs before they had to stop. Well, that was all well and good, I guess. We have our disagreements with FDA about whether the tirzepatide shortage is actually resolved. We continue to hear from pharmacies across the country that they are having difficulties getting the FDA-approved Mounjaro or bound in quantities they need to transition their patients. And yet, FDA did what it did, and pharmacies are bound to comply with that. Interestingly, that was on December 19th. January 1st, Eli Lilly files a motion with a brief, I guess, with the court to intervene, to in effect become a third party in this dispute between OSA and FDA. The court granted that request for intervention. And what Eli Lilly's doing is really interesting. I think they're doing, there's a political motive, but also a legal motive. And both of them think are interesting. The political motive is that we're in this period where in the next 3 weeks we're going to have a new presidential administration. Shortly after that, we're going to have a new HHS secretary. That may be Robert F. Kennedy Jr. if he is confirmed. We will have a new FDA commissioner, Dr. McCary, again if he is confirmed. And I think Eli Lilly, in joining this lawsuit, is trying to hedge against the possibility that these Trump administration officials will reverse what FDA has said in terms of the resolution of the short. I personally think it's unlikely that they're going to do that, but it is possible that they would do that. And so Eli Lilly wants to preserve its ability to make certain claims in court should FDA fold. And so if FDA bows out, reinstates the shortage, there will still be a lawsuit between OSA, but it will be Lilly as the main other party in the case. So that's the political motive. The interesting thing Lilly is doing, and their brief again and again talks about their financial interest, which I think is interesting. It's not so much about patients and access; it's about Lilly's financial interest. Yeah, go figure. But they do make one claim that is extraordinarily concerning, and that is they are claiming they are alleging in their brief that FDA does not have the statutory authority to determine when compounding pharmacies can make copies of FDA approved drugs. So a little bit of background. I'm sorry if this is too nerdy, but
Exactly how nerdy we want it.
okay, good. Well, FDA guidance has long allowed traditional compounding pharmacies to make copies of FDA approved drugs when an FDA approved drug is listed as currently in shortage on the FDA drug shortage list. Any other time, compounding pharmacies can't make copies of FDA approved drugs. Compounding pharmacy is not going to be able to make a range of drugs that are prescribed daily if the drugs are not in shortage.
Right.
The reason for FDA allowing that in guidance is continuation of patient care. I mean, just because a drug maker can't meet demand for the drug doesn't mean that patients don't need it. And many of these are essential therapies that patients' health would be at great risk if there was an interruption of that therapy. And so, relying on that guidance, compounding pharmacies for the past 3 years with semaglutide, the past 2 years with tirzepatide, have been preparing copies of the FDA approved drugs. Well, Lilly in this suit is saying FDA's gotten it wrong and they do not have the authority to do that because the statute, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, does not say that inclusion on the drug shortage list is a condition under which 503A traditional compounding pharmacies can prepare copies. And if that claim were given credence by the court, if the court were to agree, it would completely wipe out the ability of traditional compounding pharmacies to fill gaps in the drug supply chain when a drug is in shortage. And that would be darn near catastrophic. Now, when we read the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, we think Lilly's lawyers have gotten it egregiously wrong because the statute specifically delegates to the HHS secretary the ability to determine what circumstances under which compounding pharmacies can make copies of FDA approved drugs in quote regular or inordinate amounts. I think it says regularly or in inordinate amounts. So we have a specific delegation of authority to the HHS commissioner to do that. And the HHS commissioner has done that through the FDA and this guidance document. And so A lot is at stake. If FDA, this could be a red herring, but if FDA is serious, sorry, if Lilly is serious about pursuing this claim, the implications go well beyond GLP-1 drugs to a range of therapies that compounding pharmacies provide for patients when the FDA-approved drug is in shortage. And I promise I'll come up for air in a second. One recent example, and it's an important example, is in the fall and winter of 2022-23, when amoxicillin suspension was in shortage. We had children sick with RSV and some other things, and parents were frantic and prescribers were frustrated because they couldn't get amoxicillin suspension for their patients because it was in shortage. Compounding pharmacies, under this FDA guidance, stepped in and filled that gap until the drug could come back into supply. And I guarantee you, children's lives were saved because of that. That's just one example among thousands of where this guidance is necessary. And so we think Eli Lilly's a bit of a bull under China shop in taking aim at that particular provision of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and trying to undercut FDA guidance. So the stakes are high.
Yeah, they may be actually like shooting themselves in the foot because it would like further, it could potentially cause the whole system to further solidify and make the shortage process even better because they're trying to push against it. It- yeah.
Well, the interesting thing that's going on in terms of the tirzepatide shortage in particular, we do think Eli Lilly relied on incomplete data. The problem with compounding is that we are data poor. I can't tell you how many prescriptions for semaglutide injection Town and Country has filled, or a pharmacy across the country, or any other pharmacy. And so when reporters and regulators and members of Congress call and want some numbers, we just don't have those. One of the reasons for that is, as you know, compounding is a cash only business. Insurance, generally speaking, there are exceptions, will not reimburse for compounded drugs. And so there's no central database where you can figure out how many reimbursements were made and estimate from that how many patients are taking a compounded version of an X, Y, or Z. And so when FDA took Lilly's data, it was only looking at Lilly data. It was not looking at the number of patients who were on the compounded version of the drug who needed to be transitioned to the FDA approved versions of fixes. And so what I think is possible, I don't know if it's likely, I think it's possible, but I think as pharmacies begin to try to transition these patients to the who were taking the compounded drug over to the FDA approved Mounjaro or Zepbound, it has the potential to knock the FDA approved drug back into shortage because nobody was thinking about how big the demand was for these patients who were taking the compounded version. One thing that might undercut that is prescribers who are not transitioning their patient from compounded tirzepatide injection to Mounjaro or Zepbound, but are transitioning them to compounded semaglutide injection. Now, and I know it's not a necessarily one-to-one comparison. It doesn't necessarily mean that because a person's taking tirzepatide injection, semaglutide injection is going to be just right for them. But there are some patients for whom that will be the case, and prescribers are making that judgment and transitioning them over there. So the only thing I think that might keep tirzepatide, Mounjaro, and Zepbound not to be kicked back into shortage is these patients may be transitioned over to the semaglutide product until semaglutide comes off.
So I was purposely trying not to interject because you were so on a roll. And I could see the passion that you have. And I think the recent article you had with Eli Lilly was very good. One before, like that one, I really want to see your passion come out. You ready?
That was that the one where I quoted Buddy the Elf?
Is it they sit on a throne of lies?
Yeah, that's a quote.
Buddy the Elf.
Funny movie Elf.
Oh, that article sparked a lot of important conversations. And for us and for me, this article paints like this vivid picture of the challenges compounding pharmacies face, particularly with pharmaceutical industry's attempts to misrepresent our work. And you do such a great job of calling out their tactics, including conflating compounded medications with counterfeit drugs and making unsupported claims about safety. Could you please expand on why you believe they've taken this approach and how it impacts patient care? And yeah, like I said, feel free to get more.
I am one of these people who I like precision in syntax, and so saying that someone lies is a pretty strong assertion. Sometimes people can just be mistaken. They could misspeak. But saying that the drug makers, and again, it's a funny quote from the movie Elf, sit on a throne of lies is not hyperbole. They are purposely misrepresenting, mischaracterizing pharmacy compounding, and attributing safety concerns that don't exist. And so the purpose of that opinion piece was really to delineate, I guess, the range of stuff that the drug makers had done, and the drug makers, Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk. We've had cease and desist letters against pharmacies that are just a fusillade of crazy claims that do not comport with what law and regulation say, but are designed to intimidate, I believe. And those cease and desist letters have gone not only to pharmacies, certainly some have gone to med spas, they've gone to telehealth platforms, but they've even sent cease and desist letters to prescribers of compounded GLP-1 drugs, which I think is kind of ballsy. And again, it's an effort to intimidate. They have sent letters to patients, Eli Lilly has, who, and who knows how they got the data, but they have determined that patients were taking a compounded tirzepatide injectable, and Lilly has sent letters to those patients saying, "We would like access to your medical records to determine if this is appropriate." And Eli Lilly's CEO said that it was part of their strategy to use threats and intimidation to try to stop the compounding of the tirzepatide API. There have been a number of actual lawsuits against compounding pharmacies. Some of those against med spas, frankly, have had validity. There were a number of med spas that were making claims about compounded drugs that they shouldn't have been making. I mean, you can't pair a compounded tirzepatide or use the name for a compounded drug associated with the brand name. So there's no compounded Wegovy. There's compounded semaglutide, but not compounded Ozempic or compounded Zepbound. Neither are compounded drugs generics. You can't call them generics. They're not remotely generics. And so some med spas were doing that or alleged to be doing that, and they ended up having to settle with the drug makers because of those claims. But there were other lawsuits against compounding pharmacies that were simply filed. It's strange to me that these behemoth drug makers are filing lawsuits against mom and pop pharmacies, but they are, because the pharmacies are preparing kind of versions of their drugs. They have touted supposed adverse events associated with compounded drugs and suggesting that the numbers are extraordinary, when in fact the number of adverse events associated with the FDA approved GLP-1 drugs are exponentially higher than those reported for compounded versions. And when you compare the adverse events for compounded versions versus the FDA approved drugs, they are remarkably similar. Again, any serious adverse event needs to be investigated, needs to be taken seriously. One of the interesting things that a lot of folks don't know, but on which the drug maker is relying in making these claims about adverse events, is that FDA's adverse events reporting database is a record of reports of adverse events, but it is not definitive. FDA does not go out and determine that the drug in question actually caused the adverse event. So there's no causation there. And the drug and that goes for FDA adverse events reported for FDA approved drugs or for compounded drugs. So they've misused the data, maybe misunderstood the data. I don't think they've misunderstood it. I think they've misused it. They touted dosing errors with the vial and syringe system that compounders use, and yet that vial and syringe system has been used for decades for insulin and a range of other things that they don't seem to have too much interest or concern about dosing errors with those. And so it's just a range of legal strategies and intimidation designed to I think strike fear in these small business pharmacies that are meeting a need for a life-changing drug at a time when these drug makers cannot stop meet that need.
Counter-country compounding, you know this. We pride ourselves on our rigorous safety standards and compliance with both state, federal regulations. We consider ourselves in the top 1% of compounding pharmacies do our triple accreditation, PCAB, HDHC, and NABP, while many compounding pharmacies don't even have one accreditation. You've highlighted four of them. Not all compounding pharmacies are alike. Can you speak to the importance of accreditation and the role of high quality testing in distinguishing high quality, responsible 503A pharmacies from the bad flavor you mentioned in your article?
Yeah, uh, let's start by saying that in our healthcare system, FDA-approved drugs are the gold standard. If an FDA-approved drug is judged to be appropriate for a patient by a prescriber and is available, is accessible, is not in shortage, the FDA-approved drug is what should be prescribed and dispensed. But as we've seen over this 3-year period, FDA-approved drugs are not always available. And in that instance, federal law, FDA guidance, and the laws of every state in the country allow compounded versions of FDA-approved drugs to fill that gap. Compounded drugs are not FDA approved. How could a drug that is prescribed and dispensed for an N of one for an individual patient, how could all of those be individually approved by FDA? But drug makers and others have made the leap in their public statements that these drugs are not FDA approved, and so therefore they are somehow inherently unsafe. And that's nonsense. Compounding pharmacies, like Town and Country and many others, adhere to a rigorous compliance framework. It is not the same framework, not the current manufacturing practices that drug makers must adhere to, but it is a framework designed to ensure the safety of the patient who's going to take that customized compounded drug. And we're talking about the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. We're talking about numerous FDA guidance on everything from essentially a copy that allows the compounding of copies of FDA approved drugs, FDA guidance on insanitary conditions, and on a range of other things. We're talking about state law on top of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and FDA guidance. And then the overarching standards for the profession are from the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, the compounding chapters of the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. And those are in one way or another incorporated into the laws of every state in the country. Standards of the U.S. Pharmacopoeia are sufficiently rigorous to assure that the pharmacies that adhere to them are taking care to protect patients. I know Town and Country does that, and numerous other compounding pharmacies across the country. So now we've been talking about semaglutide, tirzepatide, injectables. When we talk about the compounding of a copy, we're talking about Wegovy and Ozempic, the Novo products. Those are injectable. And we're talking about Zepbound and Mounjaro, manufactured by Lilly, injectables. Not just any pharmacy can prepare an injectable medication. Only a pharmacy that is a sterile compounding pharmacy and has a certified sterile compounding lab can do that. Among compounding pharmacies in the country, only about a quarter of those do sterile compounding. It is a higher standard. Talked about the chapters of the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. Chapter 797 of the U.S. Pharmacopoeia is about sterile compounding. And again, a rigorous standard that those pharmacies have to adhere to. On top of that, there are accreditations. You've already mentioned some of those. So PCAB accreditation, the Pharmacy Compounding Accreditation Board. See it over your shoulder there. NABP accreditation, settle. And pharmacies who are that are investing in high compliance compounding with high integrity pursue those accreditations. And so there are a large number of sterile compounding pharmacies across the country that have attained those accreditations. Now, does that mean that a pharmacy that, and you're not going to like me saying this, Steve, does that mean that a pharmacy that doesn't have an accreditation is somehow being cavalier and is not compounding with integrity? It doesn't mean that at all. It does mean that those that have attained those accreditations are bound to adhere to a higher standard and are regularly inspected to determine that they are adhering to that high standard. And so we encourage compounding pharmacies to pursue accreditations by PCAB, NABP, and others as well. Board certification of pharmacists and technicians in the sterile compounding space is important as well. I can go on, but you can be sure that if you're a patient, if you are being dispensed a sterile compounded drug from a state licensed pharmacy, you can have some confidence that drug has been compounded to the proper standard because those state licensed pharmacies are regularly inspected by the State Board of Pharmacy. I know Town and Country is licensed in multiple states, so you are not only inspected by the New Jersey Board of Pharmacy, but you're inspected by all the other boards of pharmacies of states where you hold a license. Is it privilege? Yeah, it's fairly rigorous inspection standard, and then goes for other pharmacies around the country as well. So these notions that drug makers put out there that somehow state licensed compounding pharmacies are not preparing safe drugs, it is largely nonsense. There are always bad actors, even among drug makers. We want to talk about some of the findings of FDA inspections of drug makers. Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk, neither one have entirely clean hands in that regard. And I think we ought to focus on the fact that both compounding pharmacies and drug makers have a shared interest in assuring patient safety.
And I kind of want you to talk on that and how do we better communicate to the public and policymakers the critical role compounding pharmacies play during shortages? Because if we don't step in, then the gray and black market steps in.
Yep.
Open arms.
Yeah, and that has this the thinking of some patients has been affected by the FDA's resolution of the tirzepatide shortage. And I know you've seen and we've seen an uptick in traffic and conversation in some of these Reddit chat rooms and on TikTok where people are buying offshore these substances that purport to be tirzepatide or semaglutide and mixing it with distilled water and injecting themselves with it. That's crazy.
Yep.
But people are doing it. And so we are concerned about the black market. You have heard already in my syntax that I refer to state licensed pharmacies. All pharmacies in America have to be licensed in the state where the pharmacy is located. And so if it is not a state licensed pharmacy, it isn't a pharmacy at all. So I want to take care not to call these entities that are purporting to be pharmacies because they're not. They are illegal operations, they're illicit operations, but you can go online and purchase what purports to be semaglutide or tirzepatide injection without a prescription. And that is dangerous. I have seen estimates that as high as 85 or 90% of online quote pharmacies aren't pharmacies at all, but are bogus. And so patients need to take care about where they are acquiring their their compounded GLP-1 drugs. So some things that a patient can do to make sure that the pharmacy is a legitimate pharmacy. One of the first things they can do is look it up on the State Board of Pharmacy website. If a pharmacy has to be licensed in the state where it is located and any state to which it ships compounded medications. So the patient can look up the pharmacy name, and if it's there, they know that it is licensed. If it's not there, that ought to raise a red flag. It could mean that that pharmacy is not licensed in that state. It could mean that it's not a pharmacy at all. Patients should also have conversations with their prescribers. I suspect that the prescribers who send scripts to Town and Country for compounded GLP-1s know your pharmacy well. I would imagine that some of them have even been in the pharmacy and taken a tour. A patient can ask a prescriber about a pharmacy and can tell by the prescriber's familiarity with the pharmacy whether this is legit. So that's another way that patients can have greater confidence that the pharmacy is legit. They can also talk to the pharmacist, and I know for a fact that if a patient walked in and wanted to talk to your pharmacist about where you acquire your active pharmaceutical ingredient for your GLP-1 drugs, or do you do third-party testing, those are conversations that your pharmacist would be perfectly open to with those patients. So those are some ways that patients can have greater confidence that it is a legitimate state licensed pharmacy. APC has created on our website a tool to help patients do that. And I'm going to give a URL here, so I'll try to say it slowly. It is at a, the number 4, pc.org. So a4pc.org/ is it legit? And if your patients will go there, it is a shortcut to the licensee lookup function on all of the State Board of Pharmacy websites. So it would be very easy for a patient to look up there whether the entity that is preparing their GLP-1 or other compounded drug is legitimate or not. Again, ultimately, patients need to take care. They need to make sure they're using a state licensed pharmacy.
The difference between 503A and 503B. You've made it very clear 503A pharmacists seem like under country are held to very high standards. Could you clarify for our audience what makes 503A pharmacies just as viable and vital in the compound as our 503B counterparts? The reason why I'm asking this question is we have seen a lot of misinformation about this since 503 outsourcing pharmacies are regulated by the FDA. Furthermore, there are rules that 503Bs are supposed to follow, but they are not. We're actually seeing a lot of 503Bs selling directly to patients. How are they doing this? So can you just clarify like some of this misinformation, like the discussion between 503A and pharma? There's good actors, bad actors, and there seems to be bad actors in all these different categories that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, again, I will spell out the differences for the two, but I would start by saying both are essential to our drug supply chain, particularly when it comes to the sort of shortage drug compounding that we are seeing with the GLP-1 drugs, but also a range of other drugs as well. So 503A and 503B are sections of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic. 50 is the section that authorizes traditional pharmacies to prepare customized compounded medications when in the judgment of a prescriber there is not a suitable and commercially available FDA approved drug. And that takes there are a range of therapies for which that is done. Steve, I know I don't need to tell you, but well beyond GLP-1s, think about, well, let's start with animal compounding. Compounding is essential in the veterinary space because of all the sizes and breeds and species of animals. Back to the human side, compounded hormone therapy. So 503As do a whole range of therapies, autism compounding and men's health and women's health and all of those sorts of things. A 503A pharmacy is a traditional pharmacy. It's a pharmacy maybe on Main Street, USA. Many compounding pharmacies are hybrid pharmacies. They are 503As, but they also do traditional retail dispensing as well as some amount of pharmacy compounding. 503As are licensed by states. I've already mentioned that earlier. A 503A pharmacy has to be licensed in the state in which it resides and to any state where it ships medications. 503A traditional pharmacies can only dispense is an important word, can only dispense pursuant to a prescription. So 503A pharmacies are a pharmacy to patient, one-to-one. Mrs. Jones walks in with her prescription for compounded tirzepatide injection, and Town and Country fills that script, especially for Mrs. Jones. Those are 503As. Section 503B of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was created in 2013 in with the Drug Quality and Security Act, and it was intended to create a new class of compounding entity called outsourcing facilities. And outsourcing facilities, unlike state licensed pharmacies, are licensed directly with the FDA. There are only 85 of them in the entire country. They are required under federal law to adhere to the same sort of current good manufacturing practices that drug makers adhere to. And because they adhere to CGMP, current good manufacturing practices, they are authorized in federal law to distribute. Notice that's a different word from dispense, the word I used with traditional compounding pharmacies. 503Bs are allowed to distribute drugs in larger batches to hospitals and clinics without a prescription. And so 503A traditional pharmacies must have a prescription for an individual patient. 503Bs can create larger batches of compounded drugs and distribute them to hospitals and clinics for distribution or for administration rather in the hospital or clinic without a prescription. So think about the range of compounded drugs that are used by hospitals for surgeries or by ophthalmologists for cataract surgery in a clinic. 503Bs tend to supply a lot of those drugs. Now, about a year ago, FDA issued a draft guidance statement that sort of was an earthquake for her 503Bs. It changed the landscape a bit in that FDA indicated that a 503B outsourcing facility preparing larger batches of compounded drugs and distributing those drugs not to a hospital, not to a clinic, but to a 503A traditional compounding pharmacy was okay. It met the requirements of the Drug Quality and Security Act. Well, that was new. And so a number of 503Bs at the same time we're seeing these blockbuster GLP-1 drugs that are in shortage, a number of 503Bs decide to get into the game and prepare GLP-1 injectables who distribute to 503A traditional pharmacies. And so again, we're data poor. I can't tell you how much of the market of compounded GLP-1s is prepared by 503Bs right now. I can guarantee you of the 85 or so Bs in the country, it is a small percentage of them that are preparing GLP-1s, period. Many of those 503Bs are closely associated with a specific hospital, health system, or clinic and are preparing just certain drugs for those. I would guess there are 10, 11, 12, maybe 15 at the highest 503Bs that are in this space. So 503Bs have to adhere to current good manufacturing practices. CGMP is a higher standard for testing and the preparation of the drug. Is a drug prepared by a 503B inherently safer or more effective than a drug prepared by a traditional compounding pharmacy? No. It just means that the testing and the standard that the 503B adhered to is more rigorous. And so the drugs prepared by 503As that are adherent to all those U.S. Pharmacopoeia compounding chapters are undergoing rigorous testing. You are required, and I know Town and Country does it, you are required to send a sample of every batch of a compounded sterile injectable that you prepare out for third-party testing to determine potency and purity and all of that before you can ever dispense any of that batch of drug to an individual patient. So there's a place for Bs, but there is absolutely a place for 503As. And let's talk real quickly about what that means when we have drugs in shortage. If tomorrow a major drug goes into shortage, the manufacturer cannot provide it. The fallback in federal law is 503Bs. 503Bs were created in part to do shortage drug compounding and fill the gap until the drug manufacturer could bring its FDA approved drug back into supply. Here's the problem. If that drug goes into shortage tomorrow, it's going to take a 503B from 3 to 5 months to ramp up production of that drug if they determine that there's an economic model under which they can do that, and sometimes there's not. What about a patient who needs this perhaps life saving drug that is now gone into shortage, and the 503B is not yet ramped up to prepare it and may not choose to prepare it at all? That's where 503As come in. And so we support policies that would allow 503As to fill that gap. 503As can certainly do so now pursuant to a prescription. That's why a prescriber, a doctor, a nurse practitioner, a physician's assistant, or in animal health, a vet, can provide a compounded version of the FDA-approved drug to fill the gap. We would like to see that extended to distributing shortage drugs to hospitals when hospitals have need of those drugs that the 503B has not ramped up production and the drug is not yet back in supply by the drug maker. And so one of the things we're advocating for in Congress is the ability of 503As to do more to alleviate drug shortages in that way.
Right. That's the End Drug Shortage Act, right? With
That's fine. Yeah, it's Senator Tim Kaine and Tom Cotton's bill. It does some of that. That bill is an incomplete version of what I've just talked about, but it does help FDA better anticipate coming drug shortages and manipulate the players to be able to address those shortages sooner. And that includes traditional compounding pharmacies as well as, of course, 503B outsourcing facilities.
awesome. Hmm. Now let's just talk about really, really, really long bud dating for GLP-1s. We've had some issues talking to some of our clients that are like, "Oh, we're getting like 1 year bud dating GLP-1s from other 503As." So, can you explain and the benefits of this is it allows patients to stop right. If you have a 1 year bud, you can get a year's worth of tirzepatide. So, can you explain the rules on bud dating with closed containers, as well as once the vial is punctured?
Yeah, and I have to tell you, Steve, that's not my bailiwick. I'm not a pharmacist, but it might be useful to talk to my colleague Kenil Davis, the pharmacist on our team. But I can tell you there is right now some stuff going on with extended beyond use dates that we do not believe comports with the standards of the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. And I would urge pharmacies to take care to make sure that they are fully compliant there. I would urge 503Bs to take care to make sure that they are applying the proper beyond use dates on those drugs. They're liable to get into some trouble if they're not. And so it is a concern. Do I think it's rampant? Not necessarily, but I do know that there's some manipulation going on at beyond use states that I do not believe is good for the patient or good for compounding.
Got it. And, before we wrap up, I'd love for you to share your perspective on the future of compounding pharmacies. So, with advancements in personalized medicine and growing demand for innovative solutions, where do you see the industry headed? What role will APC and its members play in shaping that future?
Well, that's certainly part of APC's mission to help assure that there is continued access, patients have continued access to compounded therapies. I believe there's great potential for compounding to grow in this era of customization of medications. I do want to say that we honor the fact that FDA approved drugs are the standard in our system. We are concerned about drug maker efforts who seem to assert that there is not really an essential role for compounding. The fact is, for every patient, there will not be an appropriate FDA approved drug. And so we believe the ability of compounders to be able to provide drugs to those patients at the judgment of their physician or other prescriber is going to be essential. One concern I have right now is some of the focus we're seeing in this GLP-1 frenzy on price. We are seeing telehealth platforms that didn't exist 6 months ago popping up and marketing their compounded GLP-1 solely based on the price of the drug. I believe that's dangerous. Under FDA guidance, the price of a compounded drug is not a legitimate reason for dispensing a compounded drug. The only reason a compounded drug should be dispensed is if the appropriate FDA approved drug is in shortage or a prescriber judges that a different dosage form, dosage strength, or combination is right for the patient, and that different dosage form, strength, or combination is not commercially available. Price is not mentioned. And yet we're in this era where with GLP-1s being such blockbuster drugs and there's such high demand and so many people uptaking on the compounded versions, price has become a part of the conversation. I think it's fine for compounding pharmacies to market the price of their drug. The fact is, right now, generally speaking, compounded GLP-1s cost less than the FDA approved versions. So I would say a couple of things about that and the future of compounding. These and it's not every telehealth platform. There are some great telehealth platforms out there. Some of them are our members, and we work very closely with them. But there are some out there that are sort of Johnny come latelys. They and are marketing solely based on price. And here's my concern about that. In a lot of ways, it's poking the bear. It is alerting drug makers to the notion that some telehealth platforms are viewing compounded drugs as direct competition for drug makers and their FDA approved drugs. That's not good. We have telehealth platforms that have sort of ham-fistedly begun to inject compounding into the drug type pricing debate that's raging in Congress. And I believe that's going to be bad for compounding because price is not a legitimate reason to dispense a compounded drug. And to the extent that drug makers are onto that, they have a lot more influence in Congress than we do. And I could see efforts underway to try to restrict, marginalize, and otherwise stop compounding of drug, even shortage drug compounding, simply because somehow the issue has now been made a part of the drug pricing debate. So I would tell patients, certainly I understand why many of you are taking that price is one of the rationales for you taking the compounded drug. I'm concerned that a lot of those patients are going to get sticker shock when their prescriber has to transition them over to the FDA approved drug. But I would also urge pharmacies to be careful about marketing based on price. Compounded drugs need to be prescribed either because of shortage or because of, in the judgment of a prescriber, there's not an appropriate FDA approved drug, and a compounded drug is suitable.
So no buy one, get one deals in farmers? Okay. Well, listen, Scott, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights. Your advocacy and your leadership are completely invaluable to our industry, especially during these challenging times. For our listeners who want to learn more about APC and your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, a couple of places. They can go first to a4pc.org. That's the number four, a4pc.org. Yeah, yeah, they will put that up there. And by the way, if you're gonna do your PCAB accreditation and your NABP and all that, I want to see an APC logo up there because you are valued. You guys are valued members of our organization. Yeah. The other place patients can go is to compounding.com. Compounding.com is really a patient oriented website. Right now, much of the content there is about the threats to compounded hormone therapy, but we also have content up there related to the tirzepatide shortage and efforts by drug makers to restrict GLP-1 compounding in general. And so they can learn a lot about compounding at compounding.com.
Awesome. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you're as inspired as I am by today's conversation, please share this episode and help spread the word with the vital role compounding pharmacies in healthcare. Until next time, stay well and stay informed.